Hello, my name's Asia. I'm a program manager at Humanities Washington. We're a nonprofit organization whose mission is to open minds and bridge divides by creating spaces to explore different perspectives. We hold hundreds of events each year, and you can check out our work at humanities.org. So today we have three wonderful scholars here to discuss America's historical use of law enforcement to enforce racial hierarchy, the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the next steps for our society. Our two panelists, Professor Luther Adams and Professor Latasha Levy, will be in conversation with our moderator for the evening, Professor E. Eric Davis. So without further ado, I'll ask each of you to please introduce yourselves, starting with Professor Adams.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me here. I hope you are all in good health and good spirits. I am Luther Adams, Associate Professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma. I teach in the program on ethnic, gender, and labor studies, primarily dealing with African American history and culture. I am the author of Way Up North in Louisville, African American Migration in the Urban South. And I am currently writing a history of police brutality entitled No Justice, No Peace. Again, thank you for having me.
And good evening, folks. This is Eric Davis calling. This is Eric Davis. They call me Professor E, and that just goes way back, and I'll have to share that at another time. But it's an honor to be here with my esteemed colleagues to talk about this important issue. And so my role as facilitator would be to just kind of ask the questions that I think the folks that are watching are going to want to hear answers to, and get to the conversation. I'm currently an associate professor at Bellevue College, and I teach sociology and ethnic studies.
Good afternoon. My name is Latasha Levy. I'm a Black Studies scholar. I teach African American Studies in the Department of American Ethnic Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. My research and teaching focuses on Black social movements, Black political history, primarily post-war World II, Black political history. And I actually taught one of the earliest Black Lives Matter courses, college courses at the University of Virginia in 2015, and have been teaching Black Lives Matter ever since. And so I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
All right, so the thought I had, folks, is that between the three of us, we can obviously talk a lot about this. But if we were to start, Luther, with you, just kind of this idea of the history around policing, and the underlying question really that I have, my curiosity really surfaces around this idea of what is the history of policing, and how has policing historically been so detrimental to the African American experience in the U.S.
Thank you. I think I would start really with slavery. I know that for many scholars who look at the history of policing, they start with the Metropolitan Police in New York and in England, the idea of Robert Peel and policing coming out of the experience of Ireland and colonization, or they'll look at France and the Girondin. But really, I think in the United States, and thinking about African Americans, policing is really about slavery in the beginning. And then, of course, it goes through the era of segregation. That is, to uphold law and order was really to uphold these unjust systems of racial inequality, oppression, violence, extracting people's labor against their will. That is to say, when we think about the era of slavery, for many Black people, learning to read and write was a crime. Escaping slavery was a crime. Going out without a pass, which was called suffering a Negro to go at large, was the actual crime. Even tippling, that is, it was illegal in many, many states for Black people to even possess alcohol, to have it given to them, to buy it, to sell it, to manufacture it. And all of this was both attempt to better control Black people to extract their labor, that is, it was all about this system of slavery wanting to compel Black people to work. It was about fear of insurrection. And it was obviously also about these ideas of superiority. And so I think when we start with these idea of policing, then we know that the law was antithetical to anything that I think today we would think of as justice, freedom, equality for Black people. In the era of segregation, this continues. That is, we keep in mind the idea that segregation was the law, upheld by Supreme Court decisions and written into the legislature record of many states. That is, when Black people like Rosa Parks refused to move from the back of the bus, they were breaking the law. And so we may think about this as civil disobedience, but said another way, we'll understand that enforcing the law, enforcing segregation, enforcing the rules of slavery was also therefore putting policing in the side of the police opposite Black people's freedom dreams, their aspirations for equality. In the most basic sense, I think that was the case. One other thing I would add to that is many of these laws, like segregation and slavery, did not just rely on state authorities, but really called on ordinary, everyday white citizens to help police Black people. That is, in terms of segregation or in terms of slavery, it was ordinary people who helped enforce the law. It was ordinary people who could stop any Black person and ask, ordinary white people who could stop any Black person, free or enslaved. We keep in mind that free Blacks also often had to have certificates, have to have documentation showing that they were free and were subject to many of the same kinds of laws that regulated the behavior of Black people. So, who were enslaved, that is. So one of the other things I think that is important is that while much of this was the law itself particularly was founded on violence. That is, if Black people did not obey, they would be branded, they could be castrated, they could be whipped, they could be physically punished. Now, today we think about policing and we call it force, but force is just a fancy word for violence. And we'll keep in mind, therefore, then that this system that is controlling Black people, oppressing Black people, is ultimately resting on violence. Otherwise, why would anybody obey these laws? So, that's where I would start. And I'll try and keep my answers brief so we have enough time to talk as much as we can.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. I think, Latasha, before I hand it over to you, I wanted to echo one thought. That is, there's these viral videos out there of what, pejorative terms they say are negative terms of Karens who are actively calling and policing everyday citizens, stopping folks from entering their own apartment building, calling in when they're having a barbecue along the waterfront. And I think that the everyday folks in our communities don't necessarily see the connection between the history of policing, the actual current status and state of police, but then also the ecosystem of the US that has created a circumstance where you really feel certain people in our society feel authorized to restrict and limit. And I see you're nodding, Latasha, so I'm going to hand it over to you on that note.
Yes, I think maybe the connecting thread is just the criminalization of Blackness that happens after slavery, that it continues to thread social relations in the United States. And so anything that Black people are doing, whether that's, a sleeping student in the college dorm, room, anything is criminalized and therefore justified in terms of over policing. I think that it's important that people are making these connections to slavery, but the reality is that we don't even have to go that far back. Just the way that policing has been expanded in the 20th century, I would just highlight during Jim Crow segregation is just a problem and crisis of lynching, that police participated in lynching, either through releasing someone who was in prison or deputizing white citizens to police as mobs that are terrorizing Black communities because of, some accusations around being a criminal. And more often than not, Black men were accused of raping or assaulting white women, but Ida B. Wells, who single-handedly almost launched an anti-lynching crusade in the late 1800s, early 1900s, found that for, white people were calling for the lynching of Black people because they were successful, because they would not defer to white folks, because they were doing well economically. A lot of times it was jealousy, and that the police participated in these lynchings, not only in the South, but across the nation. And so that's one period in which, we could say helped to shape sort of police culture and the connection to Black criminality and the criminalization of Blackness per se. But the other thing is just the expansion of police resources and connecting it to the military that happens in the 1960s in direct relation to social unrest around civil rights, Black power, anti-imperialism, labor movements, okay, immigration, all right? So policing was connected then to military in terms of the 1965 crime bill that Lyndon B. Johnson passed, that, also provided military weaponry from the Vietnam War to local police forces that were used to repress social unrest or social protests and resistance in the 60s, okay? And so just in the 1960s provides a important backdrop for what we see today in terms of the militarization of the police and continued priorities around controlling and controlling Black bodies, So I think the lynching piece and the war on crime, I think were devastating in terms of creating this animal of policing in the United States that's just beyond, out of control and deadly,
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing that I always want to come back to, and that is that perhaps COVID and the fact that things have been hyper enhanced because of the pandemic, and that more people witnessed the George Floyd lynching, and that's what I refer to it as. I'm not sure where you all are, but that's what Eric Davis calls it. And that we had in 2020 a person, an African-American man, held down for 8+ minutes in the middle of broad daylight in the streets of a major American city. And it's one of the questions that's out there, right, is, so why is there such a divide on this topic? Why is it that folks don't get it? What's so hard to understand? Because for me, it's like, what didn't you see it? And when folks are surprised by the Breonna Taylor situation and further surprised by the Jacob Blake situation in Kenosha, I'm at a loss as to why they're surprised. So maybe one of you two can help me, because I don't understand how they don't see it. Luther, what is it that I see that they don't see?
Well, I think, frankly, I think this whole idea of shock, surprise, and not knowing is one of the key methods by which police brutality is perpetuated. That is, every generation acts as though they have to discover it again for the first time, as though we didn't know there was Isaac Woodard in the 1940s, and there wasn't Amadou Diallo and Sean Bell and Sandra Bland. And so it's as though every time, people are shocked and surprised by this. But I think that behind that, it's really a question about truth-telling, testimony, and who do you believe? And the ways in which I think Black truth-telling has often in the United States been pushed to the side. Now that is part of, I think, perpetuating the very order that these things are putting forward. But I think in many ways, this is not as you suggest, it's not a new issue. I think few Black people would see it as a new issue. And I think moreover, for most Black people, it's an issue that cuts very, very close to home. That is, when we see George Floyd, when we learn about Breonna Taylor, this is not an abstract issue. This is an issue that touches each of us very personally.
Yes, I totally agree. I was going to say that I think a lot of people are feigning ignorance, and I can't, and I want to be specific to talk about this divide is racial, and it reminds me of the 1967 Kerner Commission, which was established. The Johnson administration wants to understand why were there, over 100 riots in 1967, the year of rebellion. So in 1968, they create this task force. They publish this report to figure out why are these riots happening and how can they be prevented. And what it says in the report basically is that we are moving towards two nations, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And what they say in this report, they concluded that white society is implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, white institutions um, perpetuate it, condone it. All right. So this is the language from 1968. That was 50 years ago. And as Dr. Adams mentioned, as early as the NAACP at the beginning of the 20th century, they are already talking about how to hold police accountable, and so Black people are being arrested for no reason at all, for reasons that white people would never be arrested for. But then those arrest records kind of make the case that Black people are more criminal, and so then that makes the case that Black people then need to be policed or surveillance. And so you have this long history of people, identifying the problem, having reports and recommendations, and saying that white supremacy, that white racial attitudes are a problem that perpetuated, created, and condoned it. And that's no different than now. And so I don't believe that people don't understand. I think that maybe we need to get psychologists on the case to figure out what's going on with the psyche, because there's cognitive dissonance happening here. There is deep denial from generation to generation, from a people where there's a culture of supremacy that claims to be intellectually superior, but somehow is dumb as doorknobs when it comes to understanding how racism works. I don't believe it. And so I think that we have to, getting back to that truth telling, what is going on in white culture, from generation to generation, where Jim Crow was permissible, where lynching was permissible, where people were silent about it, okay, where police participated in it. And instead of rethinking policing, they just have expanded it with more resources and more police. There's something going on here that I think is really a degradation of values. What do we value in this society? What do you value in this society where the loss of Black life or the policing of poor people and citations and generating revenue through policing for your city, harassing people, why is that acceptable? And then you see these videos, we have all these videos now, and it's the only difference. Black people, Black families have dealt with police violence since the era of slavery, right? Since the era of freedom and under Jim Crow or Jane Crow, in the North. We've always had to deal with this. You now have these videos and people still say, well, we don't know what happened before the video. We know that George Floyd was accused of using a counterfeit bill. We know that Sandra Bland was simply smoking a cigarette in her car. We know that Trayvon Martin was just walking down the street with snacks during halftime during a game. We know that Breonna Taylor, even if you thought that she was a drug dealer who was, perhaps selling drugs in the mail through her boyfriend, which they didn't find drugs in her house, all of these crimes are nonviolent. None of these crimes would warrant execution. Okay, but you still have so many white Americans who would say, we don't have the full story. We don't know what happened beforehand. There's still good officers out there. And so there's something deeply wrong going on in the culture and the spiritual aspect that we've been afraid to really tap into. Okay, so in other places, I talked about how there's so many studies on the Negro problem in the United States. And Julian Bond during the Black Power era have asked us to think about this white problem in the United States. And we still see that in terms of the disparate attitudes or perceptions that white people have in terms of policing, including the discrepancies between white police officers and Black police officers, as far as how racism impacts not only police forces, but also society at large. There's a huge discrepancy there. And I think that's more about self-preservation than it is about ignorance. At this point, we can't say it's about ignorance.
Yeah, you know, what struck me as you were speaking, Dr. Levy, is that I hope that those who are watching this video are still watching the video. I think that what comes down to the fragility that D'Angelo talks about and privilege that many have talked about is that, ooh, I don't want to listen to this anymore. I don't want to hear these three Black African-American scholars talk about it. It's a noble thought to talk about, but too uncomfortable, don't want to do it. And so cognitive dissonance is what you spoke to. And I was thinking maybe it's willful ignorance or just absolute negligence. But for those of us whose children reflect George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and for those of us who wonder about those three boys in the back seat of the car that Jacob Blake was trying to get back into or check on his children before he got shot in the back, that it's real. And Professor Allen, you said that it's real for us. And so is this an underlying, is this just how deep racism goes? Is this some would argue that this has become worse under the current or soon to be outgoing, supposedly, political administration. Do we attribute it to that, as history teaches that? So I'm handing it back over to you, Luther. Is that something that history would say is the politicization of the topic, or is this a continuation of what we've always seen? Is this something that became hypersensitive because of the current president, soon outgoing president? What are your thoughts on that one?
Well, I think my thoughts about it are that in some ways it connects to another facet of the conversation Dr. Levy was just having before. And whether we think about this as cognitive dissonance or willful ignorance or what, I think part of it is that we often in this issue of law and order focus on the issue of law and overlook the issue of order. And when we think about it in terms of order, I think it helps us understand that there are times where the economic order, the racial order, the political order is threatened. After the Civil War, 1940s, the era of World War II, the Great Migration, the Civil Rights Movement. There have been people like, Nina Simone that sang about it as the backlash blues, but essentially the idea that as Black people do make progress, there is efforts to essentially maintain the order, to keep the status quo, to keep Black people from making progress. So in this current period that we live in, I don't think it's hard to really understand the impact of President Barack Obama, the large numbers of Black people and Latinos and Latinx, or how you want to say it, the people of color that came out to put him into office. And I think the ways in which, for many, this signaled, and this was, of course, the idea of his campaign, that there was a change, that there was hope for a change, that America was moving towards a new future, contrasted by this idea of making America great again. And the whole idea of again is not looking forward, but rather looking back. Now, obviously, for people of color, when you start looking back, you're looking back to slavery and segregation and lynching and these kinds of things. And frankly, slavery is part of what made America great. It is the economic engine that industrialization was founded on. At the same time, therefore, I think that when this order gets challenged, really what you're seeing is an incredible effort to preserve the order, to keep Black people essentially in their place, to let us know in a very powerful and very violent way from the highest levels of government to those people who are driving their cars through crowds, to the so-called Karens who are now policing where you are supposed to be or not, what your place in this society is. There is a strong question of order that I think is sometimes lost in the focus of law. But I think when we think about order, it helps us recognize, whether people want to hear it or not, that this is a country that is profoundly and deeply racist. I mean, sometimes you have these strange conversations, is America racist? I'm like, well, once you start getting to a point where you even have to question that, you don't know anything about the history of this country. It was founded on slavery, the theft of land, genocide. And of course, we know that there are people who struggled against that always. But without the land and the labor of Black people, certainly America would not be what it is. And that order, therefore, again, is economic, political, social. And as much as there are people, I think, who are highly invested in change and crafting a new future, there are others who are quite conservative in the sense of maintaining the status quo, keeping things as they have been.
And I'm going to hand it to you, if I may, Professor Levy, because I think I want to hand this one off to you and switch over to this idea of Black Lives Matter. But I can hold that thought and let you go ahead and say what you're going to say in response to Professor Adams.
Yeah, there's a connection here. I want to just remind us, though, and remind everyone that Black Lives Matter came to fruition under Obama's administration, right? And so some of, the Blue Lives Matter bill, or, there were some efforts on Obama's part in terms of protecting police, down to inviting a police officer who harassed, and locked in, handcuffed Henry Louis Gates for going into his own house, And so instead of sticking by the problem of over policing in that situation, where a neighbor called the police because he was locked out, he's trying to get in his house, who didn't recognize that a Black man lived near her, even when they recognized he was the resident, they still put him in handcuffs. Obama invited that officer to the White House and had a beer with him. We call it the beer summit. So instead of holding that police officer accountable or to have a larger conversation about over policing, he was deferential to it. And, when we think about ICE and deportation, people were also calling for abolish ICE before they're not before, but in relation to abolish police. There's a connection there. And so under Obama, and it just dawned on me that I remember when Sean Bell was killed in New York. And I want to say maybe this was right before Obama was elected. He got on television and said, it's a shame that he was killed. That's a travesty, but you don't have to riot. And nobody was rioting. There was no riot. But just for him to put that image out there, like, you don't have to, be fed up and explode in a stereotypical way, And so Obama was also pretty problematic. But I think he was forced, people forced him to take a stand under his administration. And even after Ferguson, with the report that came out of the Department of Justice, there are all these recommendations. They were recommendations. They weren't implemented on a large scale. But they revealed so much. That report revealed just how corrupt and corrosive and racist the nation continues to be. And I think anytime, if we think about how the military has been tethered to policing in this nation, that means that colonialism, racism, and imperialism is also embedded in these institutions.
And I greatly appreciate that that you two are demonstrating, and we three are demonstrating, that there is a wide-ranging thought within the African-American experience and community, and we also are not afraid to speak truth to power, even if it's in reference to a former president like Obama, because several of my members of my community, as far as my friendship network, have made the same point and said that we need to be consistent and critical across all of these things, and to really address kind of the institutionalized racism of it all, that this has got some power in its history that one individual politician or president would not necessarily be able to dismiss. And so to kind of advance that conversation, I think a lot of people don't really understand the kind of the basics of Black Lives Matter. And you taught the course, Tasha, what is the, give folks an understanding of what that movement, how it began, and what it really means. I think there's some misnomers on what it really is.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing that Black Lives Matter has become a household name, but it seems to me that very few people really understand um, the principles and what drives the movement or how it came about, how it operates. But Black Lives Matter, the reason why I started to teach it, because I was very resistant to the slogan itself initially. Um, I thought that it diverted attention away from the problem and that it was dehumanizing to me at the time thinking about it to explain to another human being that my life matters. You know, it's like I'm not going to explain that something is wrong with that human being if I have to explain to them that someone should not be killed who is unarmed, who hasn't committed a crime, or, you know, we have a justice system that you're supposed to go through if you've committed a crime. But to actually explain to another human being that my life matters, I was very resistant to that. When I started to listen to the founders, Patrice Cullors, Alicia Garza, Opa Tometi, then what stood out to me is how they describe Black Lives Matter as an ideological intervention. And I said, that's a way to enter into a conversation or just thinking through what this movement means as it's unfolding, if as an ideological intervention. And so what I gather in terms of what Black Lives Matter is that it organized itself around resistance to anti-Black racism and state violence. And so I started to think about the concepts that they were using to frame, you know, reactions that people were having. And just this is just the tipping point when Trayvon Martin was killed in 2012, and George Zimmerman, who was self-described as a watchman, neighborhood watch, you know, just thinking about the history of watchmen too, before policing and slave patrols. But he was acquitted, you know? And so on Facebook, Black Lives Matter kind of came about. In 2012, though, Marcus Hunter, who is a Black studies scholar in sociology, actually did tweet out Black Lives Matter first a few months after Trayvon Martin, but it didn't become a full-blown movement until 2014 when Ferguson erupted. And so really these hashtags provide a space to catalog, you know, conversations to connect people as people were grieving and trying to figure out what are the next steps to protect ourselves from police violence. But what I really appreciated about the concepts and started to pay attention to is that it's not just about police violence. Black Lives Matter was making connections early on between police violence and state sanctioned violence, other forms of violence. So state violence in itself is not just about physical violence, it's about the defunding of public education. It's about the ways in which Black mothers are criminalized as well, you know, using welfare services. It's about the deportation of people who are undocumented. And so they were connecting all of these things, the lack of healthcare services and defunding medical services and getting rid of clinics and stuff in poor communities. And so early on with Black Lives Matter, there were protest around a livable wage, you know, $15 for fast food workers that was going on. And so people were making these connections. That is not just that police violence is just one problem in a larger issue that we have in this country around state violence. And so I will welcome people to, you know, actually look at what they were talking about in regards to state violence and how we resist state violence. The other thing that I thought was important was anti-Black racism, in terms of thinking about how the specific experiences of Black people in this country rooted in racial slavery and then racial capitalism has, you know, shaped this order that Dr. Adams is talking about, you know. And so I thought that was pretty important because a lot of times, specifically in this state, we talk a lot about people of color, not recognizing that, you know, people who are not Black but who may not be white, also harbor anti-Black racist attitudes, you know. And that's almost what makes you American. That's almost what helps you to assimilate into American culture as a person of color, is to take on anti-Blackness. And so with the primary intervention I thought Black Lives Matter was making was around these ideas around how we organize to resist the two fundamental problems in our society, which is anti-Black racism and state violence. And that part, I mean, it's in the literature, it's in the way they talk about it, but somehow people say they're anti-police, blah, blah, blah. The other important part of Black Lives Matter that, you know, these folks who founded it were students of the Black freedom movement and of Black freedom struggles and of Black history and economic history. And so they were, college students too, but they were also activists. And so these people that, folks didn't just drop out of nowhere, decided to do this just to play games or social media. They were already involved as activists in their communities. And so they really thought critically about how can we create a movement that learns from the mistakes of the past. And so they use a Black feminist framework to say that we're not just going to put the black women in the background doing all the work, but not being the face of Black leadership, which we've often seen in Black movements. We're not, as queer people, going to downplay our sexuality or hide who we are or apologize for who we are, because Black queer people have always been contributing to Black liberation, like James Baldwin, like Audre Lorde, like Bayard Rustin, okay? And so they aren't going to be on the margins as they are in Black society anymore. And they literally put their bodies on the line, not just for Black women, not just for Black queer folks, but for Black women, men and children and trans folks. Like, they've pushed us to think more critically about whose lives matter and not just straight Black men, even though they've been rallying mostly around men that we assume to be straight Black men. We don't know it always, but they're putting their bodies on the line, but also saying that all Black lives matter, including those people who have been arrested and have criminal records, including people who are not going to college. And so I appreciate too that they have been resistant to respectability, that you don't have to be a perfect victim in order to have human rights, And so those elements people really don't see. And I would say one last thing, particularly in Seattle, when there was a lot of resistance within our progressive city when Senator Bernie Sanders came in 2016 to Seattle. And the two young women, Mara and Marissa, interrupted his visit. I don't know if you all remember that. And the crowd sounded like a lynch mob. There's video of it on YouTube in terms of, one man was screaming, "How dare you? How dare you?" And all they was, because Bernie Sanders got up there and said, "Congratulations for being the most progressive city in the nation." Yet you have gentrification that has pushed Black people out of Central District and Seattle altogether. The housing market economically so is also racialized. You have the building of a youth detention center when Black youth, we know that Black youth are being detained more, particularly for illegal possession of cannabis, which is interesting. So cannabis is legalized, more Black youth are going to juvie detention centers, even though we know that white youth do more drugs and do harder drugs, but they're not being surveillance and they don't get caught. And so Mara and Marissa are saying, how do you reconcile that you are putting more funding into policing, into you're building a new detention center, that you don't care about gentrification, all these other aspects of state violence, right? How can you say, how do you reconcile that? And the crowd was so nasty. They didn't like that. And as you stated, like, maybe some people turn the thing off. It's time for us to tell the truth, because our lives are at risk. Our lives are at stake, and it has been for generations.
Professor Adams, you have any thoughts on that? I found that to be brilliant, and I'm reflecting on it myself. But Luther, what are you thinking?
Well, first, I just thank Latasha for her comments. I just think there's a lot there and a lot to consider and a lot to unpack. And it's clear, as you said, you've been teaching this for a while and you've been doing the work for a while, so it's very much appreciated. I think in a few short minutes, you were really able to touch on some very important points. And I think for me, though, the most important point about it is the idea that our lives matter. And, for me, I think it's not just a question of that they matter, but to whom they matter and how they matter. Certainly, in an era of slavery, Black lives matter. Every time a Black woman reproduced a child, she had increased the wealth of some planter. They were happy to see Black children. Now, of course, they are actively trying to prevent Black people and people of color from having more children. So certainly Black people's lives matter to the prison industrial complex that cashes in on Black and brown people, locked behind bars. But what I found and still find most important about this movement is that it's an assertion for Black people that our lives matter, at the very least, to ourselves, and that we ourselves are going to go forward with that premise. Now, if we can convince you that our life matters, that's cool, but if not, that's really not the point.
Yep.
Now, I do understand that in this assertion that Black life matters, is really where you get to all these other things that were just mentioned, that when you begin to focus on the issue of life, then obviously you focus on housing, you focus on food, you focus on the environment, you focus on all the things that feed us. And so I think that's what is equally powerful. Now, I think in doing so, it's clear that it has not always been understood what it's about and where it comes from. And I think there's been those conversations that many of us have seen replicated, that when you assert Black life matters, then, people were telling you then all life matters. Well, that's all cool, but it's not everyone who's out here facing the problems that we are facing. So to me, I think that what is most powerful about it is that assertion, the idea of life, and that all Black lives matter, and that the movement seeks to move forward really with just that basis in mind. Now, I think because of that, it's both, I think, one of the great strengths of the movement, and then something that I think makes people a little bit unsure of the movement, but that it's fairly loose in my mind, that it is not, with this, it's not like an NAACP or a SNCC or something that has a leadership and a chairperson and so forth. And, sometimes even I see, statements that are issued, and it'll say something like it was around Breonna Taylor and Black Lives Matter, Louisville says. And, perhaps there is some organization that claims that, but what I find most powerful is the grassroots nature of the organization, that it really is led by the people themselves. And so I think for many today, that focus on life, the focus on Black lives is very powerful. And at the same time, I think the incredible resistance to that is also telling, that just simply saying Black Life Matters is something that is controversial. Just simply saying that Black Life Matters, or even hanging such a sign in your window or attending a march, means that now you're, participating in a group that the government is trying to label as extremist. So it's an interesting time, but I think it's a powerful movement. And I think the way in which it has galvanized people and captured their imagination and led that imagination into action is incredibly powerful.
Can I just add too that I think, when I thought that Black Lives Matter was quite passive, and, the funny thing, well, not the funny thing, but the irony of it is the last point you made is that there's still so much resistance to it, that it still makes white folks feel uncomfortable, that people would still, their knee-jerk reaction to say all lives matter, even though they don't participate in any way in the protection of anybody's lives, and so it's interesting that Black Lives Matter has sort of attracted the aggression and repression of the state as much as Black Power did, and so.
And the only thing I was going to add is just for the one person, and so if y'all will give me my 30-second commercial, for the one person that's watching this video that says, well, what's so wrong with saying all lives matter? And you've probably, the three of us, I'm sure, have heard these different metaphorical notions of it, but let me just give for the one person who's paying attention and still with us. If you go to the doctor with a broken wrist, they check your knee, they check your ankle, they check your neck and your head and you say, doctor, but that's not what's broken. My wrist is broken. And the doctor's response is, well, all bones matter. It's the same notion. It's not exactly the one that's injured. It's not the house that's burning. So you want the police, you want the fire department to come in and put fire on your house, but not the one that's burning, which is my house. And the sad part is that I think there are people in our community who really are like, yeah, I want my house to be, kept from burning, and I don't care about his house. And, Professor Levy, what you said was at the beginning was something that struck me, because I remember when everybody at my college was saying, we're going to wear our Black Lives Matter shirt. And I said, I wouldn't wear it. And they said, well, why not? I said, because I don't want to try to make you, I'm not interested in telling you that I matter personally. So when they say, why aren't you mad? Why don't you wear the shirt? I say, well, let me explain to you what the movement's about and why I personally choose not to wear it. But your explanation, enhanced by your add-on there, Professor Adams, I'd say helps me and others who might have even felt like I had back at the time, that I didn't want to necessarily wear the shirt because I didn't want to justify, like, I got to convince you that I matter. I'm going to tell you how I matter. And I teach a class on sociology of sports and race in sports. And I'm going to add to what has been said already. Black Lives Matter when it comes to the NBA. Black Lives Matter when it comes to Seattle Seahawks. So some of y'all are out there wearing Marshawn Lynch jerseys and Russell Wilson jerseys. But then when we start talking about the issues of systematic racism and violence in our communities, and why we shouldn't have to even discuss a brother getting snuffed out in the middle of the street in the middle of the day in American City. That shouldn't happen. But when we talk about it, y'all want to go, well, you know, why? So, you know, and now y'all are talking about defunding the police. And you don't understand that is, so that's just some rebellious thing that we should, you know, dismiss. And so, you know, in our time that we have remaining, we have about 11 minutes or so. You know, I want to talk briefly about this idea of defunding the police. And to introduce the topic, I was watching the news yesterday, and Representative-elect Cori Bush, a woman from Missouri, involved with the Black Lives Matter movement and been an activist in the community. And she described going to Washington for kind of an orientation as an elected official wearing a Breonna Taylor mask. And that multiple people said, hi, Breonna, nice to meet you. And she expressed how shocked she was that they, just kind of assumed her name was Breonna, that she wore a mask with her name on it, but obviously that they didn't know who she was. And she said it wasn't one, it wasn't two, it was several people who didn't understand it. But I needed to throw that in there just because I thought it was important to mention. But further in that interview with Representative-elect Bush, there was the interviewee, the person interviewing was saying how Representative Claiborne, long-term and you know, strong representative of the African American you know, House of Representatives member, had mentioned and basically criticized others within the Democratic caucus for talking about defunding the police. And his assertion, and others have asserted, that talking about defunding the police is the reason that many seats were lost within the Democratic infrastructure. And so, as I'm just opening up the general idea of defunding the police, which we can go anywhere you want with that, but my statement on it was just kind of like, wow, this kind of debate nationally around politics and democratic politics and the liberal wing of the democratic politics, but then it all was based on a misunderstanding, really, of what defund the police means. So which one of you want to help us understand what does it really mean to defund the police?
Well, I don't know if I can say what it really means. I think for myself, sometimes I'm uncertain what people mean when they say that. Frankly, I know that I support, you know, any effort that is oriented towards bringing justice and curbing the brutality of the police. So when I hear defunding the police, you know, some of the things I think it means are certainly, in my view, positive. So if defunding the police means, for instance, you know, in the case of Eric Garner, he was choked out on the street using a chokehold that was banned in something like 1993 after Anthony Baez, decades before. And that resulted in training roughly 36,000 New York Police Department officers at a cost of like $35 million. Now, if defunding the police means you don't give them training to do something that was already against the law and their training told them not to do, then I am all for that. If defunding the police means, in the case of Walter Wallace or people like that who have been called, you've called for mental health services and instead you send the police, if that means stripping that function of the police and giving it to another organization that is better able, better equipped to do the job without killing the person, then certainly I am in favor of that. In terms of the ultimate goal, I think that many are expressing in terms of defund the police, which is simply to abolish the police, to get rid of the police. I think that's not a new goal. That's a goal that many people have expressed, certainly in the era of Black Power, community policing, not meaning putting like a substation in your neighborhood, but actually giving control of safety and the well-being of a community into the hands of the community itself is an older idea. And I think if the idea is that we can get to a point where we don't have, perhaps using some of the language that we've had before, hyper-militarized, people walking around in our neighborhoods with body armor and those kinds of things to solve minor disputes, I think most people would support that. So I think when it comes to defunding the police, there's a lot of different ideas about what it means. But I also would say that some of the ideas of defunding the police perhaps also direct our attention towards things that, or at least away from things that could equally be as useful. So for instance, when I look at in Tacoma, the case of Manuel Ellis, or in Louisville, Breonna Taylor, I think more than defunding the police, an independent external review that has subpoena powers and the ability to prefer charges would be powerful. That is, someone who can call witnesses, they can put charges on officers and does not rely on the police to police themselves. Certainly they have demonstrated they have no accountability to one another. And so I think that there are, perhaps in addition to defunding the police, many things that could be done that would have incredibly transformative impacts on the kinds of brutality that we see today. Even things like, disallowing officers to, simply be fired and go somewhere else and be hired. Certainly, when you are discharged from the military and you have a dishonorable discharge, you ain't getting hired nowhere else. So it's unclear how it is that this is so ongoing. Now, all of those things I think sometimes are captured in defunding the police, but it seems also that what it means kind of varies by place and person.
Professor Levy, what do you think?
Yeah, so I agree that, when people say defunding the police, you got to ask them more questions because everyone doesn't agree on what that looks like. But I think fundamentally, this is not rocket science and it's not new. People are saying, how can we think about a different kind of world where that's not organized around punishment and surveillance or coercion and police violence, all right? People are just asking, like, we have to imagine something else because this is not working. How many more lives do we have to lose at the hands of the state? And why is that okay with you, all right? So we have no problem defunding education. We have no problem. We never ask, what are we going to put in place of these health services that we about to cut? What do you replace it with? We never ask that, all right? And so people are just suggesting that the excess that police departments have in both money and weaponry needs to be cut and redirected into programs that will stop crime in the first place. It's also forcing us to think about what will make us safe. So here, I've seen on television, people are concerned about the parks now in Seattle, which we all love, are now being overrun by folks who are homeless and in there doing drugs or what have you, and they don't feel safe. Why send police in there and not think about how you house those people, how you provide jobs for those people? So this isn't it's really not a revolutionary idea. The fact that it's a radical idea, again, points to the the problem of values in this country, that there's a degradation of values, that we are almost on barbarism and being uncivilized. Like, how do you reconcile in your mind that police can have access, that you can cut all these things down to austerity, social services, education, no jobs, you know, no housing, and feel uncomfortable with cutting the police budget? And so let's be clear. I think part of what people should be saying, to make it clear to folks who don't understand this idea of defunding the police, is that we spend $100 billion a year on policing. Even here in Seattle, there's a movement to defund the police that won some victories that people need to look into to figure out what are people actually saying about how to defund the police in Seattle and what that means. When they're pointing to the fact that in Seattle, they're spending $30 million on overtime. I just heard on a program yesterday that overtime, they get $30 million, that people are also being paid exorbitant salaries, you know, that it's perpetuating inequality. And so fundamentally, people are saying, what does it mean to have public safety? That we're charging the police to handle situations that they are not trained to handle. And so it requires us to be more imaginative. When you call 911, you know, you're not going to ask a police officer to come over to handle the fire. You have a fire department to do that, and people are trained to do that. And so people who are advocating for defunding and abolition are just simply saying, we need to make sure that there are other avenues to handle certain situations, whether that's around mental health, domestic disputes, that we don't always have to call the police, who then say that they're only trained to kill when they shoot, that they're not trained to de-escalate, that they're not trained to, you know, shoot someone in the leg instead of shooting them to kill them in a situation where you're dealing with mental health or what have you. And so this is not a radical idea, but we have no problems defunding everything else that will help every individual in this country thrive. What is wrong with that, you know? And so George Floyd was the spark. People have been talking about the movement for Black Lives was around divesting from prisons and punishment and coercion or what have you, and investing in communities and institutions that help people to thrive. And so it wasn't until George Floyd that his life was snuffed out of him with the camera rolling. And so we know that reforms don't work. In Minneapolis, they had the anti-bias training. They banned, we have police. Everybody wanted to do the police cameras, and this stuff is still happening. And so we've been reforming for 100 years. Over 100 years, we've had recommendations and reforms. The police departments refuse to reform itself. The good apples refuse to hold the bad ones accountable because they are silent. They're not organizing. Where are they to condemn the misbehavior or whatever? If it's just about bad apples, we don't even hear from them. They have been operating like around a code of blue that we talk about, like a gang, like a group of thugs. This is unacceptable. If any other industry, when you don't perform well, you know, you get cut. Like you said, you get fired. So I wonder, like, people have to, you know, kind of just stop acting like these things are impossible. During slavery, people thought abolition was impossible. You know, during the civil rights movement, people thought breaking down Jim Crow was impossible. And so here we are. This is our charge for our generation, to figure out what side are we on and what kind of world we're willing to fight for.
If I may, I agree very much with you that it really is a question of imagination and what kind of world do we envision, not only for ourselves, but for our children and our children's children going forward. I do think, however, that the issue is not so much a degradation, that is, we are falling back. This has been the bedrock of what America is. That is, it has been based on force and based on violence from its inception. And I think it is that issue that makes it so hard for people to imagine another world. I think because of that, it also makes it hard to see that the police and the issue of policing, you know, is tied up, as you could see, with Breonna Taylor, with grand juries. It's tied up with judges. It's tied up, in other words, with a whole legal system. We may call it the law, but in other words, that's something intrinsic in the functioning of our society. And so in many ways, what I think is most paramount is that, and it is so clear, particularly even when you think about places like Nigeria, where, you see this effort to end SARS is connected to all those things that Black Lives Matter is talking about. In other words, they understand that policing and the idea of force and violence being used to regulate our society, control people, is also the same thing that compels people to live in poverty, compels people not to have education, compels people to live in the system that we do. So in that sense, I would say, in fact, it is both radical and revolutionary, in the sense that what it is really asking for us to do is not just reform, but to really completely transform the society and the world that we live in. And I think that is where the real resistance to it comes from. So far, insofar as it is Black and brown people who are in their place or being put in their place, then it's going to, for many people, not really rise to a problem. Now, we understand that it is a problem, and it certainly is a problem for Black people. It certainly is a problem for indigenous people like John Williams, who's killed, for carving on the street, essentially. It's a problem for, that Mexican national in Pasco who was throwing rocks and was killed. So we understand that this is a broad problem. And I think as you begin to really understand the way in which policing is not just about policing, the law is not just about the law, it is really about, do we live in a society that is founded on violence? And how is that violence being used to compel people to really do things that we would step back if we really looked at it through our history and understood that they were unjust, they were oppressive, they were unequal. And we may look back at slavery and look back at segregation, some of us, and think those things were wrong. Some of us, would probably have all three of us in chains right now if they could. But we also understand that that's not just a question for the past, that's also a question for the future. How is force and violence being used to maintain oppression and inequality today? And I think dealing with policing is really the place where you get to that. And, as you talk about it as state violence, I rarely use those kinds of words, but it's really a way to understand, I think, very clearly how the impact of force, the impact of violence is much broader than standing on someone's neck with your hands in your pocket. It's something much deeper than that that's going on in our society. And I think Black people have an eye to see it, a history to understand it, some of us, but others, as we said, perhaps willfully continue to maintain the order and are unwilling to really move towards a society that will be completely transformed by the things necessary to abolish this violence.
I am beyond, I'm feeling a certain level of back in the day when I was in my African American Studies classes at UCLA, and I'm just loving both of y'all right now, and looking forward to taking the class with you, even though I probably got my own classes to teach. To say that this was an amazing conversation is an understatement, and I am honored, beyond honored, to have shared some time with you and learned so much. And I want to thank Humanities Washington for bringing us together. I want to make sure that I give thanks to those folks who saw this as a topic that we needed to talk about. And I sure do appreciate the frankness, the depth of the conversation, and much love. Appreciate y'all deeply.